Hey everybody, how's it going? Andrew here, and I just wanted to say, if you're listening to the show, there's probably a good chance you're finding the discussions helpful. But even if the content is helpful, if you're ever uncertain of how to apply this information and take action, then having a guide that understands your needs and helps you find solutions could make all the difference for you. Look, I love helpful content and do my best to apply it in ways that help me grow my business and even myself. But I also know navigating challenges alone or even with a team can be a daunting task. Hey, I'm a strong believer in a bad decision now is better than making a perfect decision later. But you know what? I'd rather reduce that risk and take action now. This is the reason why I have my own guides to help me on my journey. So if you feel that you're struggling with anything in yours or feeling uncertain about how to tackle your challenges, let's chat. I'm always happy to learn more about my listeners, especially if there are ways that I can help you solve your problems. So if you're up for a chat, please visit rengenmarketing.com and click on the Let's Chat in the nav menu. At the very least, my goal is to get to know you a little so I can help guide you in the right direction. So thanks again for being such great listeners. Let's get right to the show. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about creating share-worthy moments. Now, if there is one thing most of us strive to do as game creators, it's to stand out. And standing out doesn't get much better than when people talk about your game and share it with others. But understanding exactly what the reasons and moments are that compel players to share games with their community can be a mystery. So in today's conversation, we're going to explore what share-worthy really means and break that down into specific categories so you can better identify your game's share-worthy moments and hone in on them to create experiences that your players will want to talk about. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, how's it going? And we're back, and today with me again, we have Neil Edwards. Neil, how is it going, buddy?
It's wonderful, as always, is talking with you when we get to ramble on about fun game nerd stuff, Andrew.
Thanks, and yes, it is a lot of fun rambling on. Well, I don't know. I disagree. I don't think we ramble on too much. We just have very thoughtful conversations. Maybe I'm giving us too much credit there.
Speak for yourself. I think you give me too much credit.
But, okay, yeah. Fair enough. Well, folks, have Neil here again on the show. And honestly, it hasn't been that long because he was on episode 299 where we talked about aligning your marketing and games UX. Really interesting topic. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, I highly encourage you to do so for a few reasons. One, we've been getting a lot of good feedback about that episode in particular. So those of you, and you know who you are, who've been like chatting with me and saying like, hey, when are you going to do something else with Neil? Well, here it is. So enjoy that. But no, in all seriousness, it was outside of the feedback that we got from the community, really good show. Definitely tune in. And in this one, we're going to do things a little bit differently, dive in a little bit deeper on some stuff. And because for some quick context, since that episode, since we met at GDC, Neil and I have been really talking a lot of back and forth, and a lot of things are really top of mind. And then it just made the most sense to like come here today and have this conversation. So if you want to find more about Neil, because we're going to get right into the discussion today, but if you want to find out more, please check out that episode. But just really quick, Neil, give us a quick intro in terms of who you are, why, and a little brief intro. If you will.
So I've been in the game industry about 10 years. Spent about half of that as a game designer. Still consider myself a game designer. And then I spent about the last 5.5 years as a co-founder and the head of UX at UX is Fine. Run the UX department and help build the business there. And I'm actually excitedly now moving into my next venture of making my own games and stuff like that. So yeah, game design, UX designer, long time. Excited to be here and dive more on this stuff.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that, letting us know. And again, more information about Neil if you head back over to that episode 299. So we're going to get right into it today. Folks, it is going to be a little bit off the cuff, but don't worry. I'll make sure that we try to stay on topic and on point.
Andrew will wrangle me in.
I'll do my best. Learned. But so, as I mentioned earlier in the intro, is we're going to be talking about creating some amazing Shareworthy moments. It's more of just an open discussion to really explore, what exactly are Shareworthy moments? What is Shareworthy? Like, what does all this stuff mean? So let's do that, Neil. Why don't we first kind of define and consider what is Shareworthy? Because I have my own thoughts on what that means. I know you do, but how can we better define it? So let's say for whoever we are, that it's a little bit more objective and focused.
Yeah. So for me, the way I think about defining a shareable moment, I kind of jump right into what are the facets of a shareable moment? And obviously it's something that stands out, shareworthy, noteworthy, tomato, potato, we all get that. So my head starts to go to okay, well, what makes something stand out? And some of the essence for me, I believe we talked about this last on the podcast. I know I've talked with other folks on other podcasts when we were discussing Marvel Snap and some of its mechanics specifically. My head first goes to, because I think about emotions, I think about experiences. That's very much how I think about games. I go to emotional potency, right? I think about some of the most memorable moments for me in games that stand out are the ones that are accompanied by the strongest emotions, whether they be positive emotions or negative emotions, right? And I always say to people, I'm on this topic, sit there and think of your most memorable gaming moments. And a lot of them are super highs or super lows, right? I still tease, I'll never forget, I was 11 or 12 years old. I died in the wild in RuneScape, which was the first game I was ever obsessed over. I had my Addy legs, my Addy chest plate that I just worked really hard for, my rune axe, and every shred of gold that I owned. I have no idea why I was carrying in the wild, but I died and I lost it all. And I legit cried. And I told all my friends about it. I was devastated. And I still remember it to this day, right? So that's one of the ways that I think about it is creating emotional potency. And the last little bit here, before I get off my soapbox is, we talked a little bit, I think last time about the snap mechanic in Marvel Snap, right? It's the doubling cube. It's that mechanic alone that transforms that game from, a pretty good / great game to this amazing emotional experience where you will have people, and that's what kind of spurred, this talk in my mind is I had someone who used the emojis to just trash talk me the whole game. and they snapped on me in the early rounds, and then they just shit talked me the whole game. And I was I was kind of butthurt because I was losing the whole game and I was going to quit. And then I was I wanted to beat them so bad. I landed a perfect combo on the last card, destroy, and it just chains into stuff, destroy them by a ton of power. And then I was able to snap on them right before that or after or whatever. So then I just trashed them for 8 cubes and I just sent them a thumbs up. And so that the combination of the emojis and this really isolatable mechanic of the snap just made me think man, this thing that you could completely easily pull apart out of the game and really just isolate it to its own thing, put it in there, and it makes these really powerful moments. And that's what got me excited about thinking about how do we design for these with intention, right?
Yeah. And you know what I think is really interesting is you called out to kind of the negative or the positive, right? And I think sometimes, at least from my lens and how I view things sometimes and some of the analytical work and stuff that I do, you think, negative is good and positive is, negative is bad and positive is good, right? But here's the other thing. It's it's what you just called out to, let's say with the emojis and how it was being used in that instance. I mean, in a way, yeah, that could be you can call out to saying that's a negative experience, but if you go back in terms of the design, and yeah, if you take that out, does it really change the mechanics of the gameplay? Not really at all, but it changes the memorable moments of it to the point where now, was that even intentional? Was it intentional to the point people knew that there would be players that troll, and because they're creating that conflict, it just adds another like you said, like memorable moment, even if it might not have been negative, but then it was also empowering in your case, because it was negative, and then you're like triumphant in the end and just right back in your face. I mean, that's so interesting, because something that ultimately we would probably all say may be negative, it still creates this driving emotional force.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. I think obviously toxicity is is a very important thing to manage. I think when you limit the communication enough, usually it can be kept in a fun enough spirit. Yes, it can be frustrating, but it's a thing that swings enough both ways usually. But I tell you what, like, I instantly texted all my friends in a group that I know played the game and described what just happened to me, right? And that keeps the game in people's minds, right? It's these emotional moments, and the thing that I always talk to people about is, and negative has a negative connotation, right? Like you're saying, but negative is not per se bad, right? Like, there is no victory without defeat, not to sound like pedantic or whatever, but like, that's one thing, that I think a lot of folks making casual games and things like that sometimes struggle with, is like, oh, we don't want people to like lose too much. And yes, if they lose too much, that's a problem. But the highs are defined by the lows, right? And the highs are accented by the lows. And another kind of example I'll give is like, imagine like FTL, other roguelike games that are super difficult, right? You just get beaten in those games. Granted, it's self-selecting audience, they like that. But part of what that is like, when you beat one of those games after playing it 30 times and you only win once, that's a moment where you hop on Twitter. That's a moment where you text your friends. That's a moment where you say, holy shit, I finally beat this epic boss. Or some people do it through narrative and content, like the big losses in certain games where a character dies for you, or some other, negative, there's all kinds of things, and thinking about, and I think that's what's the exciting thing, is using this as a tool to empower yourself and a lens to look at your game and say, hey, where do we think our emotional lows and highs are going to be? Do we have anything that we think would create an intense emotion like that? Should we? Is it for our game? Is it in our values, in our vision, in our spirit? Is it not? But thinking about specifically asking yourself that and looking at mechanics. Do we have mechanics, that create those moments, right? A lot of times I think, especially in like early mobile free to play, it was all about the share button. It was all about like, oh, we got to have a way to share. It's like, first, let's figure out creating something that someone wants to share, right? And then let's talk about making it easier to share.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of good things there. And I mean, geez, part of me in my head is thinking like, how are we going to like really limit this conversation so we don't go on forever? But I want to back up real quick for a moment, because you called out to like the whole empowerment thing, right? Because obviously that's a key factor. Like there's this empowerment, fulfillment, whatever it is that you get from playing a game, and it could be related to the themes, it could be related to the narrative, and that obviously the actual gameplay itself. So I wanted to kind of like even distill a little bit further and just kind of get your thoughts on this thought process that's going on in my head. From the empowerment, how do we generally get that? Because you called out to this too, like, if something's too easy, I mean, there has to be a good balance, because something's too easy, it's not necessary, it's not going to be fulfilling. I try to tell my son this all the time. He's like, I just want every gun available right now. And I'm like, dude, there's a reason why they don't do that, because no one would play it. And he doesn't get it. He's 9, but I'm sure at some point he will be like, oh yeah. But still, to my point though, conflict, challenge. These are all characteristics that we all, I would say even as humans, we all like drive for. Like we seek out conflict, we seek out challenge, but to a degree, right? We have our comfort zones and we only want to push ourselves too far. But ultimately, what is the end result? Because, cozy games aren't necessarily going to have a lot of conflict or challenge to them, right? As an example, not to call out cozy games not being challenging, but the point being is what these points lead to is some type of reward. And that then I think leads back into the kind of the whole empowerment, like full circle there. But I don't know, maybe I was just rambling on there, but I mean, any thoughts of how that plays into what we're talking about?
I think you boiled it down in a nice way. Like I'm definitely not going to say that all emotional highs and lows in games come from challenge, but a pretty big portion of them do, right?
Mm.
You think about the fist pumping wins when the dice roll goes your way. You think about the epic defeat, or how sad or mad you are when you just played 40 hours of Don't Starve and made it, 300 days and then died and you've lost everything. Or you share a defeat or a victory with a team, and that's amplified by community and collaboration and camaraderie and things like that. A lot of it has to do with skill and mastery. A lot of it has to do with achievement, right? Which is kind of a different form of challenge, right? So like, I reached rank 60, or I reached this, that, and the other thing, or I finally got this rare item. There's emotions that come with those things that are inherently scarce. They're hard to do. They're hard to find. They're rare. They're difficult. And again, those may not be the only way to create high and lows in games, but it's definitely one of the really common ways. And then I think, you see people lean on narrative and other stuff like that.
Yeah. And, by you saying that too, it just came up to mind. I don't want us to kind of like dive into this, because I think it's totally going to be a rabbit hole here, but anyone who's familiar or not with like Bartle's player types. I mean, you just outlined some of the things from the achievements in terms of what players are like. Basically what this guy did was it's a gamification kind of analysis, and he created a graph and 4 main sections, and it talks about players being achievers, killers, socializers, and explorers, right? And and then within that axis, there's also like, acting, interaction, like world, like all these other components. So it's just really interesting, because just from like this conversation now, I mean, we can kind of see how the moments are also somewhat defined about like the characteristics of the actual players themselves, but still like they really, I think, define who these characters are because of creating these memorable moments. Yeah, I could see how I can already see myself quickly going off track if we went down that route, but just want to call out to that. I always find the player types and using that as a classification to better understand your audience and stuff a very interesting one, because it's helpful to really kind of put you in that mindset.
Absolutely. And I think looking at it, and I promise I'll only say one sentence here. I think looking at it through the experiential lens, right? Even deeper, becomes really powerful, under feature sets. And this is one big run-on sentence. And the last thing I'll say is like tension and pacing definitely plays a key role in emotion, right? Like that amplifies things. You think about horror games, kind of created simulated emotions, fast-paced games, things like that can really amp up the kind of build up and release of those emotions that can kind of lead to some of these moments. Like tension is definitely a common component. But let's onward and upward.
Yeah. So, I think we covered a good amount, or at least a good sense. There's obviously only so much we can cover with the lens of emotion, right? There's just there's so much. But what about some other areas? Like, let's try to, because again, as I led in earlier, I mentioned how we can kind of we have our own lenses and how we view these things, what's considered share-worthy and such. So, well, I guess let's look at it from another one, and this is one I know we've spoken to as well, as like something that's novel, like something that like really stands out and such. Well, let's define that a little bit further in terms of how it relates to being share-worthy.
Yeah, right. So it's like people want to share stuff that stands out. So that might be an emotion that stands out, or a lot of times it's like it's kind of unique by its definition, right? Like something that I feel is share worthy is probably unique, right? No one wants to be the kid that goes to school and tells the story that everyone's already heard, right? And one of the ways I think about this is, do you have mechanics? Do you have systems? Do you have a game that creates a lot of novelty and distinct scenarios between players? And it's not to say that's a good game, and games that don't are bad. We're just, as we're laser focused on shareworthiness, the example I always like to think about here is like, no one goes to school, and says, oh my God, this crazy thing happened to me in the Call of Duty campaign this weekend, because everyone knows that all their friends are playing it and everyone had the same experience, right? But and that's not bad, right? Call of Duty's a great game, sells bazillions of copies, prints money, right? It's not a bad game at all. It's just when we think about novelty, games that index higher on discovery, games that index higher on variance and exploration, on self-expression, games that let players play in their own way, or just create tons of unique player stories, right? So if you think about the Dwarf Fortresses of the world, the Rim Worlds of the world, all these games that are, deeply simulated, or they're proc gen, so these totally random things happen to you. That's where you see the crazy stories of like, this tiger chased me and then I got on a four-wheeler in Far Cry and then shot this barrel and it exploded. All these crazy, unexpected, games that index highly on chaos also, do a lot of this. But you think about those games and these, the whole Dwarf Fortress, cats drinking beer that fell on the floor and then licking it off their paws and then them dying of alcohol poisoning. It's this whole thing. It's this legend on the internet. And people, when people encounter what they know and have confidence are unique stories to them, that's why D&D gets shared so much, things like that, because I know instantly my story is going to be novel to you. I know that your content was different than mine because I was in procedurally generated world or something like that. And also self-expression, right? Like you look at, if I can create in a game, then I know I can have novelty, and that feels worthy of sharing. Look at the 8 bazillion videos on YouTube of like people that I saw someone the other day built all of like some part of Game of Thrones in Minecraft, like just crazy stuff. And that's facilitated because players are either they're funneled into completely unique scenarios through some type of simulation and randomization, or they're allowed to create unique scenarios, right?
Yeah. And to a very similar example that you just provided, Minecraft's obviously, kind of a given based off of what that is. But also like with, Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. I mean, how many videos and stuff where people are like, hey, this is what I made.
Absolutely.
Like, I've seen TIE fighters. I've seen some crazy stuff that I don't show my son, because then he's going to ask me, how come you're not creating it now? And can you get the stuff for me? Because some of the challenging aspects. But still, to the point, yeah, I mean, just again, there's just so much more, like you said, that those experiences and everything else are very different, even if, like, we know, yes, the gameplay is the same. Yes, it's very common and everything else. But I mean, there's a big component there of that player base, of that community, and of self-expression and so many other factors that are really playing into this shareworthiness. That's like in a lot of ways, there's the aspect of the, again, what you said earlier, there's the aspect of leading with the right intent and kind of maybe having a good perspective of how to create these experiences from the get-go. And I think, like, it's not always done, but it's I would assume it's extremely challenging to get to that point, to really visualize that whole path in terms of what a player is taking, what are they feeling and expressing in games. And obviously that's always the main goal, but it's just that process of, time, experience, talent, everything else that leads into that mastery of it. But it's part of the process. I don't know. Sorry, went on a bit there, but
no, you're good. No, absolutely. It is tough to create these moments, right? And it's not like we're doling out, paint by number tips here of how you make a game that boom, bang, bing, people just want to make a million YouTube videos on. But it's useful for us, and it's fun theory crafting to think about. We say lenses a lot, but I really like that term because I think about these as lenses to look at your game through. And this one would be, hey, do we have things, are players going to have distinctly different experiences in our games? And again, it's not bad if the answer is no, but if you want the answer to be yes, or you're uncertain, it's good to think about, okay, well, how different are the experiences our players going to have? How different, how many unique kind of wild things or different things are happening in our play tests and things like that. And looking at it as a lens, and then looking at, beg, borrowing, and stealing other, from looking at other games and like, okay, well, how do other games do it, right? How are they creating unique moments? How can we, meld some of that thinking into our games? Like a super quick anecdote, I was playing The Long Dark the other day, which I love. And I was like trying to craft something on a crafting bench, and I thought I heard something, and I was like, oh, whatever. And then I thought it was like, holy shit, and I turned around, it's a bear. And I was like, oh my God. And that's a pretty punishing game. And I was like, I'm going to die from this bear. So I ran inside and I went back outside, and I was like, I threw a flare at it and I thought he would run away. And then and I went outside to check again. He didn't run away and almost killed me. And it was this whole thing. Right. But I knew that didn't happen to anyone else. Right. Or maybe it had similarly, but it wasn't a scripted moment. Right. So thinking about, do we have unique moments that are non-scripted happening to players? And that's just another lens to look at your game through, to help with virality, right? Because it's so tough to compete out there. Anything you can do to get your game to spread through word of mouth like this, there's value in considering, right? And being intentional with.
Now, I have a question for you based off of something you just said, because it's a very important question, I think, as you're making games, right? So, and what it was is asking yourself, like, hey, do we want players to have this type of experience or not, right? Like, kind of leading with some form of intention. But now I'm going to flip that a little bit and saying, like, and we'll explore this a little bit, and it's a good segue into another area we're going to talk about in a moment. But now, let's say, should we phrase things, or how should we look at things as how important is it to look at things we want players to have, like the experiences we want players to have, versus the experience players need or want to have? So let's maybe differentiate, because sometimes there's a very big difference, but it's very similar here too.
Well, I think the goal is you want them to be similar, right? To survive, you have to be similar, right? You have to close the gap. I think I add the caveat or the kind of flavor of that sentence of, like, is this what you want? Not from a lens of ignoring the player and, like, go make your dream game and just make something you think your players want, and then hopefully they do, and that kind of one directional. It's more about, yes, you need to backwards validate it. These presumptions or hypotheses, educated guesses about what we think our game should be to be successful, all should come from the players, right? They should come from the ecosystem of, these are things over here we see people are into. These are experiences we know motivate some people. We just need to craft that into the right experience for the right audience. So it's less about, oh, we want our game to be this in a vacuum. And it's more about, we know these types of things engage people, and we think this will be a unique combination for these types of players. And so that's what we want for our game to be for them, right? And whether we've done research or whether we're just competing in familiar genre twists where we know certain things work and we're trying to make our own unique flavor of it. I think it's about coming at it from that angle. And the reason I specify and put emphasis on what we want our game to be is because your game does have to be directed. It does have to be intentional. Right. You do have to pick an audience. You do have to pick a type of, some subgroups of people that come from different genres. Everyone's coming from other games to potentially come spend their time and money in yours. And so it's to get rid of that idea you and I have talked about, of a good game, right? Like there's no such thing. I mean, yes, there are good games, but the best games in the world, some people would say, are trash because they're not for them, right? So that's kind of what I get at when saying the game that you want to make is because it needs to be a game someone wants to play, but it also needs to be specific. And the thing that you are aiming for, right, which is kind of what we're getting at here, is like, maybe you want to make a handcrafted, lovingly crafted narrative that has no novel moments in it. And maybe the people you are aiming at, it has zero novelty. And the people you are aiming at will scoop it up, and it's for them. And so that's to kind of ward off this idea that, oh, novelty is good. Oh, high emotion is good. They're all tools to help you steer towards your audience. And it's up to you to understand your audience and what they want and what they're into and what they're not.
Yeah. And not only that, I think there's another side of it that we don't generally think of. I mean, if you're thinking of it from a commercial perspective, that's obviously one thing and an important thing. But if you're also looking at it from the perspective of fulfillment, right? Like even if you're making a game as, let's say, a hobby dev, still catering that to a right audience, I think is going to be a more fulfilling experience opposed to if you just wanted to make a game for the fun of it. There's, I think, a certain level of like, hey, I just want to be able to accomplish this and I'll be excited about it. But at the same time, how much I would argue that it would be more fulfilling if it was targeted to someone, whether it's small group or big group, than if it was just you saying you did something.
Oh yeah, we all want to make a thing that resonates with someone, right? I mean, for the most part, even the, having done a bunch of hobby dev stuff in the past myself, like you still want someone to play your thing and be engaged by it, right? Sometimes you can be overcome by your own fantasy, right, of what it is, and sometimes it's game dev is partially about letting go of your own beliefs, and proving it. And proving that you've made a thing and that someone resonates with someone. And if not, iterating on that thing, right? Getting feedback from whatever source and helping you get there so it does land with someone,
Yeah, cool. No, good like way to address that too. So in light of what we were talking about a moment ago, and again, purposely trying to lead into this, let's talk about kind of like from, the shareworthiness from a perspective of need. How do we define that a little bit further?
Yeah, so this is the lens I was thinking about the other day. So high emotion, novelty, and then this concept of all this content we see about games, right? Strat guides, beginner guides, how to be a boss with this character, yada yada yada. People have an inherent sense of utility, right? We've learn tutorials on YouTube, game tutorials, how to fix our toilet tutorials in real life. People have this sense of teaching and understanding, right? And so they know, when something will be useful because either it was useful to them or, people get it. And so, that kind of got me thinking, those tend to come from, a lot of that content comes from games with high skill and mastery, right? If you look at Valorant, you look at League of Legends, you look at Clash Royale, you look at all these things that have like depth and mastery and skill and a way to be good at and a way to suck at. And so there's a skill journey there of growth. There's a lot of people out there making content of how to get better at these games. And so that's when I think about the lens of need, right? The lens of, does your game facilitate people making content that they are confident will be useful to someone else, right? That's one reason people share. They share because they're like, I know this will be useful to you. And there's the utility of learning, right? And then what we might get into briefly here in a minute is like the utility of things like entertainment, right? It's not pure utilitarian, right? But people share content that they think will be useful, air quotes, to people in their life because it's entertaining. But that first one, I definitely think about a skill and mastery, but also the last little bit there that I think is so fascinating is this is where you start to see the lenses kind of converge, right? You take something like Clash Royale, right? There's a ton of mastery and skill. And so people sharing content through the lens of it's useful to someone, it's teaching them, but also boom, we've got the lens of novelty, we've got build making and deck making, we've got the lens of novelty through self-expression. I found this deck that I'm going to share with you online, which helps you through mastery and teaching and the lens of need, but also helps you through the lens of novelty. And so you start to see a lot of these things converge in kind of interesting ways. And I don't have any research to back this, but I think when you can think about stacking those lenses, and so people have multiple reasons to share the same types of content out of your game, I believe my hypothesis is that makes that compulsion and your through rate of people sharing stuff higher.
Yeah. Well, I'll kind of back you a bit here on at least with some research I've actually done, where as an example, because as you're saying this, I'm like, oh, I just found this recently with some work I was doing on a project where it was really interesting within, let's say, for example, there was a particular audience I was diving in deeper on, and one of the main components and characteristics of this audience I found was simply the fact they find a lot of value in being able to have something of value, such as a game, to share with other people and are passionate about talking about it. And when they have something that's like a hidden gem, within this audience, they absolutely love sharing it with their community. It's like a driving factor. And it's not exclusive to this particular audience either. But it was very prominent, which I thought was very interesting. You still see it across the board in certain capacities, but it was just really interesting that there's the need. We might think face value need is like demand, market demand, and all these other high level things, which obviously there is. But then there's even going deeper into what else is that need, and the value is one perspective of it. And to make something shareworthy, having those experiences, and then it goes right back to what you're saying about novelty and everything else. But I thought that was really interesting because as you're saying that, I'm like, that's what immediately hit my head.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I was thinking about it as like this almost like outward lens of like people know this content will be useful. And so it's about the usefulness to the other person. But what you just said made me think about the need that I may have and the way it makes me feel and the way I'm perceived and how that makes me feel as being a content sharer, right? Mm-hmm. And the reciprocal feelings I get, when my YouTube video gets cool comments or a bazillion views and I feel like I was helpful to the community, and the way that gives me an opportunity to like feel genuinely helpful and get an emotional boost that's completely meta to the game. And it makes me think about, I saw this BuzzFeed, I don't read BuzzFeed, I swear. I saw this BuzzFeed TED Talk from a bunch of years ago about how they started thinking about their content. It's a great TED Talk, by the way. You should totally watch it. They started thinking about their content. They call them jobs, that the jobs they do out in the world. And their whole thing was like, how do you make something go viral? How do you design something to go viral? And so they did all this categorization about the jobs that a content share does and the nature of an article. And so they started to break down like doing the job of making someone laugh, or this whole like, this is totally me, or remember this from our childhood, this connects us. And so they started talking about all these kind of ultimately interrelational things of what's the thing that achieving this shares, and writing content starting from that to then defining the content, instead of writing the content and then like, oh, whatever happens, oh, we realize people share this because it's relatable. They actually started doing the process completely reverse. And they're like, okay, we need to fill a gap where someone's going to share something because it's funny and because it's like, oh, this is totally me, right? And it's self-deprecating. And then they figure out what to write. It's completely upside down. And they found it super effective, and they had a lot of success with getting people to share stuff and hitting different points of their audience because they're hitting those different kind of needs or jobs or utilities, if you will. So anyway, you saying that kind of reminded me of that. And I think it's very related of like that guy, that person you're referencing, wants to be the recommender, right? Wants to be the expert that found this hidden gem and is like, and I know people like that really love feeding their friends new Spotify playlists and like, things that make them, feel fulfilled and good on the inside of like providing people with cool shit they like to consume, right? That's like the influencer recommender, I think is totally a thing.
Yeah. And I just want to back up real quick, because what you're saying about that TED Talk about how they kind of like reverse engineer the process away, or to think about like, hey, what does this invoke essentially? If I can recall, I believe YouTube does this specifically. Like within YouTube, they have a whole team that's basically trying to figure out what's going to be the next trend with topics and stuff. And they kind of just like, they do their initial research or whatever, and then they put it out there. And I don't think it's like, I think they do it in a way, I don't know the specifics of the process, but how I recall it is simply, then they put it out in there, and then they just see how it bubbles up. So they've done the research, they create the content, they put it out there, whether they create the content or give the ideas to other people, whether content creators, influencers, and then let's see what goes happen. And there's a very, very driven reason for this is because by doing that alone, that can skyrocket revenue. So, but I mean, if you think about it, the practice of doing that and having that understanding is yeah, it's going to drive revenue bottom line in the end. It's just a matter of how you approach it and other things like that. I really simplified that though, but still, that's effectively what's happening. And a scary thing too, not to go in a rabbit hole here, but sometimes with some of the content that's out there, just very general content, sometimes very conflicting content. Sometimes that content can be generated for an intent purpose for that to get eyeballs to promote a specific message or whatever the case is. But it's done all the time. But still, I think there's very ethical ways and fun ways to do it. And those are the ones we're really focusing on in terms of, I think, that little snippet of what we were just talking about. But
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Agree.
But no, that was really cool, though, that you shared that, because, again, we don't generally think about these things and how involved that they can be to get to this level of understanding. And then especially, again, bringing it back to our games and knowing that it's sometimes it doesn't always have to be. And sometimes we don't always have to have these intentions, but it's still cool to know that we can go that deep and look at it from a lens where we're doing it not just from a commercial perspective, but also a fulfillment perspective, a sustainability perspective, and knowing that, we're just giving something back of value and everything else to the community, to the players and everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all the stuff we're discussing, I don't see any of the stuff we're discussing. I mean, you can use anything, I guess, in a predatory way, but yeah, I don't see any of this as like overwhelmingly capitalistic, only concerned and interested in pumping the revenue. Right. I think this is about making shit that people really are compelled by. Yeah. And yes, that absolutely has business benefits, right?
Exactly.
But if you do it in kind of a straight up, pretty normal human way, it ends up being this fair trade cycle, right? Where like you create a really high emotional moment or a low that then sets off a high, or you give someone this novel new experience, this rare moment that happened to them, or you allow them to feel useful to the community around them. Like those are all things that players enjoy. They also just happen to be smart business, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And that's one little caveat, as I've started to do my own dev stuff, is just zooming back out to other worlds. I didn't think I would learn really anything about game dev from watching a TED Talk about BuzzFeed, right? But it's business, right? I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a dev, whatever, at the end of the day, even if you're a designer or not, I mean, thinking with a business mind. And so that's one little just, tidbit that's really resonating with me is just zooming out into different perspectives, because what we do for a living is try to motivate humans, right? And there's a lot of different industries, arguably almost anything on a screen. That's what it's about at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So there's so many different perspectives to learn from. And so I was really grateful I got linked that article, or that video rather. So anyway.
So, all right. I know we're going to come on time here in a moment, but there's one area I kind of want to cover real quick, because it still falls into everything we discussed, everything we do, and that is entertainment. So with the whole lens of Shareworthy, like how do we break it down from an entertainment perspective?
Yeah, I think it's I think we'll try to keep it quick because it covers a lot of what we just talked about. But it's like people, again, they understand the content has a place in someone's life, and so when we have a chance to entertain people, when you make a moment that genuinely makes someone laugh or be aghast in a game because something so outrageous happened, those are where people get on Twitter. That's where they text their friends. That's where they post screenshots on Discord, all that shit. And so, mechanics that tend to lead to that are games that are high in chaos, right? Destruction, chaos, self-expression, similarly, so it's like, you think about like Goat Simulator, you think about like, there's like 8 bazillion videos of like crazy kills of GTA 5 and GTA Online, right? So again, the more open-ended that your systems are, GTA is basically like a physics simulator with weapons and humans running around in it, more or less. And that's why, you see all these videos that people are compelled to share, because I saw one the other day, like some semi hit something, flipped up in the air, and it killed a jet that was flying by. And it was like this nuts 1 in a million thing, right? So it's novelty and noteworthiness, but it's also this entertainment value. And so I think looking at that lens is about like, do we have things in our game that are going to create outrageous or funny or just kind of like unbelievable, surprising moments? Like, think about all those emotions, not necessarily pure player emotions from gameplay, but those emotions of like reactions to stuff, and ask ourselves, does our game have outputs of this? And are we looking to, like we said earlier?
Yeah, no, really good points. And I mean, and from entertainment too, I mean, it really just encompasses those like essentially those core key moments. And again, I mean, folks, we're only scratching the surface here, but I think, and I'm hoping that, from our discussion, everything, you can kind of just, start filling in the blanks in terms of, how is entertainment defined? Like, how are these like shareable moments really defined? And yes, it is very nuanced. It's very dynamic. But I think if there's one goal that we have out of this conversation over anything, it's just to have different perspectives to kind of view your own work, view things a little bit differently than than how we may typically take a certain approach to our processes and whatnot.
Yeah, I think one concrete thing to like say out of this is like the way I think about using these lenses is like, get a core loop of your game, get some different LODs of core loops, not just the most zoomed out core loop, but, zoom in on your combat and do some loops there. And they don't need to be fancy, like sticky note the damn thing, but do some loops that paint a picture of someone playing your game, and then look at those and look and sticker them up and say, okay, do we feel like there's a chance to create something that's noteworthy here that lets a player stand apart? Do we think there's a chance the player's going to feel like they could create something that's useful or needed for someone? Is there a chance here it's going to create a high emotional low? And just, get a blueprint of your game and look at it and think about where could the outputs be that create these moments. And again, none of it's, if you have none, it's not necessarily bad. It's about your game, right? But that would be the way I think about using these things, is like, where in the time cycle on these loops are we going to spit these moments out? Where are we trying to? Do we think we have, too few of these, and it also gives you something to check against. Okay, we think combat's going to create these crazy scenarios. Okay, cool. Well, now you're play testing. Is that actually happening? This faucet that's supposed to be pumping out these emotional highs and lows, is it actually happening? Are people having intense combats? Are they pumping up their hands in victory when they get done playing a match? Or are they just like, right? So you start to create benchmarks to work against.
I mean, I would, in a way to kind of summarize it real quick, is just like, in a way, you're kind of looking for where are those moments that you're really empowering and rewarding your players. Because if those two things, and I am oversimplifying this, but if those two things are happening, then there's, I would say, more likely than not of creating those share-worthy moments.
Absolutely. Awesome.
Well, Neil, we're definitely on time here. I can't thank you enough for being here. Any I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of thoughts here. I don't know if we can really encompass, because we didn't really write down any like key takeaways, but I think the last one you said, honestly, was probably the best thing, like just to make it more concrete in terms of just, really looking at your game, seeing how you can apply it. And look, folks, if you are doing that and you can't find something right away, I wouldn't stress about it. This is a process. Like no one has the right answers. We just have ideas and maybe some concepts, like Neil has kindly laid out with these lenses that he was speaking of ways to possibly find and discover those things. It doesn't mean that they need to happen. It doesn't mean your game's not going to be great or good because of those things. It's just different ways to look at your game and make sure you're designing with as much intention and as wide a perspective as possible, right? We try to look at it through different angles, through different facets.
And so it's just about having the whole picture in mind and different helpful ways to view your game.
Yeah.
And then kind of almost like more info, more intention, whether you leave things out or add them in, regardless, doing it consciously is always more effective. So yeah, it's just about like things that are needed, things that are novel, things that are noteworthy, things that are high emotion. Just one other way to say, hey, is our game doing this? And what does that tell us about our game?
Love it. Thank you for summarizing that. That's so great. All right. Well, Neil, can't thank you enough for being with us today. Hey, if people want to reach out, connect with you, what are the best ways to do that?
Just hit me on LinkedIn. Honestly, that's probably the easiest way. So yeah, but no, thank you so much for having me. I super appreciate it. It's always a joy and a pleasure to get to nerd out on this stuff with you. So I've enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. Thanks, Neil. Same here.
Awesome.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.